Hello and welcome back to another update. We are currently in the second phase of the offensive. And what do I mean by the second phase? This is the phase where the Ukrainians, after their original probing attacks, have identified some weak points of the Russian forces in their forward positions in their defenses. So the Ukrainian forces are now focusing their forces in these areas to advance and take control over these areas and push the Russians back to their defensive line. So this phase will be very interesting because based on how effective and how successful the Ukrainians are in this phase, it could determine what the third phase of the war will be. It could determine what the third phase of the offensive will be. So the next phase we'll be looking at will be a push by the Ukrainian forces in three directions. So we have seen them attack across the front line here by Velika Novosilka, and now they have identified that the single most weak point of the Russian forces is by the river line itself, where they are pushing southwards in the direction of Staromilnivka. And then in the Oryhiv sector, they've identified that the weak point is in the center, so they're focusing their attacks in the direction of Robotine. As for the western part, they also identified a weakness here, so they're heavily fighting by Lubkova as well. So these are the three areas the Ukrainian forces are attacking in, and these are the three main thrusts that they are throwing their men into. So in these three directions, the Ukrainian forces are attempting to capture these forward positions so that they can advance towards the first defensive line of the Russian defenses. So that is the current situation. And through that, they have in the Velika Novosilka area, and this is the part of the front line where they have achieved the most success. They have managed to capture the villages of Neskushne, Surosheve, Blagodatne, and Makarivka over the past 24 hours. So they've managed to capture these four villages, Neskushne on the 10th, and Sorosheves, Blagodatne, and Makarivka on the 11th. So this fighting has occurred at a very fast pace. The Ukrainian forces sent heaps of troops in these directions, while the Russian forces withdrew towards the hills here to the west, as well as further southwards to protect the next villages, as they have lost positions here to the north. And through these captures, we have seen multiple videos and photos proving that the Ukrainian forces have managed to capture these villages, and you can see those on the screen right now. However, these advances do not come at no cost. With these pictures here, we can see exactly how much the Ukrainians are losing by attacking in this front line, as the Russian forces, although they are being pushed back, still have a lot of artillery and airstrikes that they can use to attack the Ukrainians as they are advancing. So although the Ukrainians have managed to capture these four villages here, they are constantly under fire from the Russian forces from the high ground here to the west. In these pictures here, we can see that the main unit being destroyed of the Ukrainian forces are mine-clearing, mine-sweeping vehicles, but there are also some armored trucks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and tanks as well. So it is very necessary for the Ukrainians to actually take control over this area. However, since they would be fighting in an uphill battle, their current focus is to push through this central part, move in the direction of Staromilivka, cut off the supplies of the Russian forces in this whole area, and then cut straight to the first defensive line, cutting off all of the supplies, forcing them to retreat or be encircled. The Ukrainian forces are here at an advantage if they manage to capture the next three villages of Staromilioske, Urosheve, Uroshene, and Savitne Brashania. If they manage to capture those villages and reach Staromilnivka, then the Russian forces will most likely be forced to retreat, although they would have an advantage staying here. With the supply lines being cut off, they would essentially be courting death. The Russians, identifying this threat to their forward positions here to the northwest, have in return launched a counterattack in this direction. It is currently ongoing, so I'm not sure exactly if it will be successful or not, but the current attempts seem to be very heavy, and they are attempting to recapture some of these lost positions so that they're able to properly defend the village of Seremonivka and prevent the Ukrainians from cutting off the supply lines of the Russian forces. So this is what is different from the Kharkiv offensive. The Kharkiv offensive, the Russians were constantly underrun, and they were unable to set up proper defenses. They were unable to do any counterattacks to slow down or prevent the Ukrainians from advancing. In turn, here in this current offensive, it is much larger in scale, and the Russian forces have adequate units to start counterattacking and actually hold the line rather than constantly withdraw. So this shows a change of strategy within the Russian forces. So how are the Ukrainians going to cope with this change of strategy? They'll have to change their own to adapt to the situation. So at the very start, they do these armored assaults similar to what they did in Kharkiv. But after they saw a lack of success with those and seeing the similar situation to that of the Russian Uledar assaults, they realized that that wouldn't pay off and it would be a very costly tactic. So they changed the strategy to be more infantry oriented and focused on attacking in areas that there is a lot of cover, which is why we're seeing this push by the river line. As there's many villages connected to each other, they can just advance from village to village rather than advancing in the open fields, which would cost them a lot more casualties. So they are adapting the situation and tactics to the situation, which has allowed them to capture these villages. So now the Russians are responding to that by counterattacking and launching heavy artillery strikes using their high ground. So the result of these fights will essentially be dependent on the tactics and the units and the amount of units each side are willing to throw into this part of the front line. Because if the Russians send more forces here to the east, then they would be weakening the central part south of Oryhiv. And if the Ukrainians just send all of their stuff here, then they would be able to break through. So it is a wager as to will the Russians send reinforcements to this part, which would essentially allow the Ukrainians to launch an offensive by the Oryhiv sector, or will the Russians instead stay here and risk the Ukrainians launching an attack here on the eastern side, which would allow them to essentially go around the defenses. So this is going to be heavily dependent on the information and the intelligence each side is able to regain. If the Russians send their forces here and the Ukrainians do not notice it, then they will not launch an offensive in the Oryhiv sector, and this part could be hit back. And likewise, if the Russian forces would relocate here and the Ukrainians notice it, then they can launch an offensive, which would allow them to then maybe break through this defensive line and gain further advances on this part of the front line. So essentially what we're seeing is both sides are testing each other to see how they will respond to the different situations. The Ukrainian forces captured multiple villages. The Russians are now responding with a counterattack. Is this counterattack a major one or a minor one? Will they actually succeed? What type of tactic will they use? We'll have to see in the videos that we see in the next couple of days and weeks coming from this time. As for the western part by Lobkove, we have seen that the Ukrainian forces managed to capture it and the Russians recaptured it, and now it's a gray zone again as the Ukrainian forces actually advanced, captured the village, and went past it in the direction of Lubove. However, they were then pushed back and they withdrew back to Stepove. So there's been a lot of back and forth in this part as the Russian forces try to counterattack whenever the Ukrainian forces take the village of Lubkove. This is very significant because if the Ukrainians manage to firmly hold Lubkove, then they will be able to push westwards in the direction of Kamyanske, capture the southern parts, and essentially move southwards in the direction of Vasilivka. And Vasilivka is a very important village here in the western part, as it is the main supply route that supplies all of the forward positions by the Russian forces here to the northwest of the first offensive line, and also allow the Ukrainians to essentially launch attacks in multiple directions on the western parts of the first offensive line. If the Ukrainians manage to break through in this direction, then they can threaten multiple important villages, as well as advance in the direction of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So there's a lot of options for the Ukrainians if they manage to keep control of Vasilivka. So this is why they are putting a lot of pressure here on the western parts in the direction of Stepove. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.